The boy admitted that his father was Chuck Norris. He got laughed at. The teacher made a show of it. But when Chuck Norris himself walked into the school, everything changed. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. The bell rang with the same dull, metallic clatter it always did, echoing through the halls like an unspoken warning. Students poured out of classrooms in clumps, backpacks bouncing, voices overlapping in the kind of careless chaos that defines high school hallways. In the midst of it all, Dakota Allen Norris walked quietly. He didn't dodge the shoulder bumps or the reckless laughter. He didn't speed up or slow down. He moved like someone used to being unseen. It wasn't that he was invisible. He was noticed sometimes, but more in the way people notice a fire extinguisher. Present. Silent. Only useful in emergencies. He wore simple clothes, a gray zip-up hoodie, jeans that fit too well to be trendy, sneakers with no brand logo. His eyes were dark and steady, the kind that looked like they saw more than they said. He walked with a posture that was neither slouched nor forced, just there. Entirely unremarkable to those who weren't paying attention, which was everyone. Dakota was 15 and in 10th grade at Westmont High, a school tucked between the foothills and chain restaurants of a suburban American town that prided itself on its sports teams and perfectly manicured lawns. The school wasn't cruel in the way some urban schools might be, full of overt fights or slammed lockers. Westmont was subtle in its cruelty. Here you could die of silence, of being misunderstood, of being ignored until you disappeared. He liked it that way, mostly, but not today. Today was the start of Career Heritage Week, a district-wide initiative where students were expected to share stories about their parents' professions. Posters had been hung days ago in bright, juvenile fonts that screamed optimism. Parents shape our future. Who inspires you? There were tables with colorful trifold displays in the commons, pictures of smiling engineers, doctors, real estate agents, and even a local news anchor who'd once gone to Westmont. The school had been humming with anticipation all morning. Dakota took his seat near the window in the first period English and stared out at the gray sky, trying not to think about what was coming. He had already decided he wouldn't speak. He would say he forgot, or that his dad was retired, or traveling, or anything but the truth. He glanced sideways at the clock, hoping the hands would move faster, but they seemed stuck in place. The desks around him filled slowly. He felt the thud of a backpack hit the floor next to him and didn't have to look to know it was Mia. She was one of the few people who still sat near him, though lately she'd begun to shrink into the same space everyone else left between themselves and him. Even now, she didn't say anything, just pulled out her notebook and started doodling. Mr. Hadley entered the room with a loud whistle dangling from his neck and a clipboard in his hand. He was a man of sturdy build and thinning hair, with a voice that boomed even when he didn't intend for it to. Once a local football legend, now a high school gym teacher, he carried himself like he was still waiting for the Friday night lights. "All right, folks," he said, clapping his hands once. "Today's the kickoff to Career Heritage Week, and we're going to do things a little differently in here. We're going to hear from you, one by one. Family stories, who you come from, who raised you, who inspires you. And I don't want the boring stuff. I want the kind of stories that make you proud to be part of that bloodline." Groans rippled through the class. Hadley grinned. "Come on now, this is your moment. Your parents did something worth talking about. And I know some of you've got legends in the family. Let's hear it." One by one, students stood and spoke. There was Alex, whose dad was a neurosurgeon and once operated on a senator. Priya's mom was a lawyer who fought immigration cases. Jamal's uncle played 3 seasons for the NFL. There were claps and cheers, a few well-timed jokes, and Hadley's running commentary kept the room loose. Dakota kept his eyes on his notebook, his hand unmoving. He could feel the slow tick of expectation pushing toward him like a tide. He had planned to say nothing. He had practiced not saying it a dozen times in his head. But then Mia leaned over just a bit and whispered, "You said your dad used to be a fighter, right? Say it." Her voice wasn't harsh. It wasn't even encouraging, really. It just floated there between them, soft and weightless, but impossible to ignore. Dakota's hand rose. It wasn't a decision. It just happened, like a reflex, like blinking when light hits your eyes. Hadley lit up. "Mr. Norris," he said, voice bright and amused. "Let's hear it. What's in your bloodline?" Dakota stood slowly. Every eye in the room turned to him. His pulse thudded in his neck, but his face was calm. His voice, when it came, was quiet but even. "My father won 183 amateur boxing matches in a row," he said. A beat of silence followed. Not reverent silence, not curious silence, the kind that hovers right before a slap. "What?" Someone snorted near the back. "Against what? Pillows?" Another voice chimed in, louder. Laughter erupted. "Was that in fight night or in his dreams? Did he fight air? Was Rocky his coach?" Hadley chuckled, shaking his head, though he made a show of waving a hand. All right, let's not be mean. Big dreams come in small packages, right?" But the damage was done. The laughter didn't stop. Even Mia didn't look at him. Dakota didn't sit back down right away. He didn't run. He just stood there, motionless, his ears burning and his fists curled tight inside his sleeves. Then, with the same slow control he used for everything, he lowered himself back into his chair like someone trying to vanish one vertebra at a time. Behind him, someone whispered, "Next up, Air Punch Nationals." The rest of the day passed in the kind of haze that only humiliation can create. A stick figure appeared on the whiteboard outside the gym with oversized gloves and the caption, "Grandpa K.O. undefeated in imagination." Every hallway he walked down carried a new version of the joke. A boy flopped dramatically in front of him near the lockers, groaning as if knocked out, while others made whoosh sounds and clapped. No one asked if it was true. No one cared. By the time lunch rolled around, someone had printed a meme with his face and the words "Chuck Jr." beat in shadows since birth, taped to the back of his chair. A milk carton was slid across the table toward him. "For protein," someone sneered, "to keep up the winning streak." The carton tipped and leaked. No one cleaned it up. A teacher walked past, said nothing. At recess, Dakota stood near the edge of the field, his foot tracing a line in the dirt over and over. Mia didn't come. She sat across the field, arms folded, eyes low. Inside, Mr. Hadley sipped from his coffee in the staff lounge. "Kids got imagination," he said with a chuckle, "or a lonely grandpa and a good printer." No one questioned him. No one corrected him. No one noticed the janitor who paused his cleaning and stared out the window for a long, long time. That night, at home, Dakota sat at his desk, flipping through an old notebook. Inside were careful notes, dates, fight numbers, newspaper clippings taped in with precision. He stared at the pages, then slowly tore one out, folded it, then again, and again, until it was the size of a coin. Then he dropped it into the trash can. He didn't move for a long time. Downstairs, the dryer hummed. The house smelled of cotton and oil. On the wall by the laundry room hung a hoodie, old, Frayed, sweat-stained, Dakota passed it without touching it, but his eyes lingered. He climbed the stairs and didn't close his bedroom door. He didn't have to. In the stillness that followed, no one knocked. No one asked questions. But the silence weighed more than any shout ever could, and something, quietly, invisibly, had begun to shift. Morning arrived without ceremony. The sky was flat and low, clouded over in the kind of gray that smothered the sun without offering rain. Dakota woke before his alarm, stared at the ceiling in the dark, then rolled out of bed and moved through his routine with mechanical quiet. No words were exchanged downstairs. His father was already out back, working the heavy bag hung in the converted garage. The thud of leather on canvas echoed through the thin walls like a heartbeat, steady and deliberate. By the time Dakota reached school, the storm had grown legs. The stick figure with boxing gloves had been redrawn, this time with a cape flapping behind it and a speech bubble that read, "Come at me, gravity." On the gym's whiteboard, someone had scribbled, "KO count, 18301. The last number circled in thick red marker. Another student had crafted a printable meme, taped to the back of every third locker, showing a blurry photo of Dakota blinking mid-step with a caption, "Chuck Jr. versus Physics, the Final Battle." Underneath, in the smaller text, someone had added, "Spoiler alert, physics wins." The laughter didn't start at once. It simmered beneath the surface like static. Students nudged one another in the halls. Whispers followed him like smoke, clinging even when he tried to shake them. A boy staggered dramatically in front of him in the science wing, flopping onto a desk and clutching his chest. "Another victory for the champ," he cried. Dakota walked past without reacting. That was the trick to surviving, he'd learned. Silence wasn't surrender. It was survival. But not everyone saw it that way. To them, his quiet was proof of guilt, of embarrassment, of invention. Because what kind of person says something that bold and then doesn't fight for it? In the cafeteria, he found his usual corner, tray balanced neatly, food untouched. He didn't eat much on school days. His appetite shrank in proportion to the attention thrown at him. A small group at the next table watched him closely. One of them slid an unopened milk carton in front of him, placing it delicately like a peace offering. "For protein," the girl said, too loud to be casual. "Gotta fuel those knockouts." Someone snorted. Another boy clucked his tongue and mimed a roundhouse kick in slow motion. The milk carton tipped. White liquid trickled across the table, pooled around Dakota's tray and dripped to the floor. No one moved to clean it. A teacher passed, eyes skimming the scene, and walked on. By the end of lunch, the meme had become gospel. It wasn't just a joke anymore. It was the story now. And like all good stories, it needed to be repeated, reinforced, reenacted. In gym class, Mr. Hadley barely contained his amusement. He called roll with exaggerated pronunciation, drawing out Norris like a punchline. Dakota kept his eyes forward. The weight room smelled like rubber and sour sweat, and the air was thick with pretense. Hadley gathered the students around the mat, clapped his hands, and gestured at the gear rack. "Let's shake things up. Some light sparring today. Show me you've got something more than memes in those arms." The class buzzed with excitement. A few kids who'd taken a boxing class or two stepped forward with puffed chests. Hadley, with theatrical flair, produced a worn pair of red mitts from his gym bag. "Here we go," he said, holding them up like relics. "Someone's been talking about 183 wins. Let's see if there's anything in the DNA." He tossed the mitts across the floor. They landed by Dakota's shoes with a soft slap. Everyone turned to look. The silence that followed wasn't anticipation, it was bait. Dakota stood motionless. He could feel the weight of every gaze, the hunger in their attention. This wasn't curiosity. It was cruelty, dressed up like entertainment. A circus of doubt. Then, without a word, he knelt, picked up the mitts, and slid them on. They were too big, the seams were cracked. The leather was worn thin across the knuckles. They didn't fit like armor. They fit like history. He walked to the center of the mat. His stance wasn't textbook, but it was deliberate. He raised his hands. Not to impress, not to perform, just to be still. Hadley raised an eyebrow. Look at that form and everything. Grandpa must have taught ballet on the side. Laughter broke the silence. Dakota didn't move. Hadley gestured again. How about a kick? Do boxers float now? More laughter. Dakota exhaled slowly, then he stepped forward and swung, a low, simple roundhouse. Nothing dramatic, just a motion remembered from mornings in the garage, from shadows on the concrete floor, but his balance was off. The mat beneath him shifted. He stumbled, didn't fall, but nearly. Hadley clapped. And the champ goes down. Watch out, folks, gravity's still undefeated. This time, the laughter was sharper, meaner. No one held back. Dakota said nothing. He peeled off the gloves with quiet care, placed them gently on the floor, and walked back to the bleachers. His face unreadable, his hands loose at his sides. Behind him, someone whispered, "Stumbles Alone, Jr." In the locker room after class, someone chalked an outline on the floor near the benches, complete with sprawled limbs and a cartoon explosion over the head. A sign beside it read, Dakota versus Physics 0 to 1. No one erased it. No one questioned it. He changed in silence. The hallway outside buzzed with retellings. Kids mimicking his swing, imitating his stumble, turning his stillness into something to mock. No one noticed the janitor standing by the end of the corridor. Broom paused in mid-motion, eyes trained on the open gym doors. He said nothing, but he didn't look away. That night, Dakota didn't mention gym class, not the gloves, not the stumble, not the laughter. He sat at the dinner table with his meal growing cold, pushing peas into spirals with the back of his fork. Across the room, his father leaned against the counter, arms crossed, saying nothing. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was ancestral. It was the kind of silence passed from fighter to fighter, the kind that knew the shape of loss and didn't need to explain itself. Eventually, Dakota spoke, barely above a whisper. I slipped. Stallone didn't move. They laughed. Dakota's eyes stayed down. They always do. His father walked over slowly, pulled out the chair opposite him, and sat without a word. Then, in a voice carved from years in gravel, he said, "But you didn't fall." Dakota didn't answer. They made a chalk outline, he murmured. Coach didn't stop them. His father studied him, quiet, measured. "Maybe I did lie," Dakota added. "Maybe none of it's real." The words stung more coming from his own mouth. Stallone didn't flinch. "You think that?" Dakota nodded once, not like someone agreeing, like someone surrendering. His father stood, slow and solid, walked down the hall. Dakota heard the creak of the garage door, the clatter of metal drawers, the shift of memory being unearthed. He sat frozen, hands curled under the table. When Stallone returned, he carried something wrapped in faded cloth, edges stained with time. He set it gently on the table, unwrapped it carefully. First came the newspaper clipping. Stallone claims 7th title. A black and white photo beneath. A younger man, arms raised, face swollen with victory, then a folded letter stamped with an official seal, a certificate, and finally, from the bottom of the bundle, a championship belt. Leather dulled, threads frayed, but the letters still visible. 7X Champ. Dakota reached out, touched the belt like it might vanish. This is real. Stallone didn't smile, just nodded once. You think I typed all this up in the school library? Why didn't you tell anyone? His father looked at him not unkindly. Didn't feel like the point anymore. Fighting's about proving something. Living's about not needing to. Dakota stared at the belt, at his own reflection warped in the scratched brass plate. Can I bring it to school? Stallone shook his head. You don't need to. But they don't believe me. Being doubted doesn't make you wrong, and being believed doesn't make you right. The truth doesn't change just because they laugh. It waits. And when it shows up, it doesn't yell. It just looks you in the eye. Dakota didn't answer, but this time he didn't look away. And in that moment, something in him realigned, not like snapping back, but like anchoring down. Outside, the sky darkened. The wind shifted, and the belt lay between them, heavy with stories that didn't need to be told to be true. Friday morning came slower than the rest, dragging with it a dense stillness that seemed to settle over the school before the first bell had even rung. The air felt heavier, not because of any change in the weather, but because the building itself carried a memory now, something raw and recent that hadn't yet dulled with time. Dakota walked the same path he always did, the same black backpack over one shoulder, the same even footsteps down the tiled halls. But today he didn't look down. The hallway had changed. It was subtle, but he felt it. The eyes that lingered a little longer, not quite mocking, not quite respectful. The whispers still happened, but they came later, waited until he had passed. The chalk outline from yesterday had been scuffed out by the janitor's broom, but a new addition had appeared in its place. A small, handwritten sign on the bulletin board by the gym doors. KO count 18301. The 1 had been circled in red 3 times over. He said nothing. He didn't stop walking. He didn't need to. Inside the gymnasium, Coach Hadley stood at center court like a master of ceremonies, clipboard in hand, whistle swinging against his chest as he paced. The bleachers were filling with students, color-coded T-shirts marking the grade levels as part of the athletic week events. Teachers lined the walls, arms crossed, faces politely engaged but visibly exhausted. Most of them were just waiting for the weekend. Hadley clapped his hands twice. "All right, folks," he called, his voice bright and performative. "Today's going to be a fun one. We've got some demonstrations, some guests, maybe even a few surprises. And who knows," he added with a wink, "maybe we'll see if our very own boxing royalty has any moves left in the tank." A few kids chuckled knowingly. The tension in the room rippled in small, controlled waves. Dakota sat near the back of the bleachers, hands clasped loosely in his lap. His name wasn't said, but it didn't have to be. Hadley's grin flicked toward him with the precision of a pointed elbow, and the room followed. "Dakota," Hadley called out, tilting his head, "care to show us a few moves? After all, 183 wins must leave something in the blood, right?" From across the court, he tossed the same pair of red mitts as before. They slid across the polished floor and landed just shy of Dakota's feet. A pause settled over the gym, not the kind filled with anticipation or suspense, but the kind that watched for a stumble, the kind that wanted to laugh. Dakota didn't move right away. He looked at the gloves. Then, slowly, he bent down, picked them up, and stood. The hush wasn't respectful. It was curious, laced with the hunger of students ready to consume whatever happened next. He walked to the center of the court, slid his hands into the worn leather, and lifted them into a stance. Not perfect, not proud, just real. Hadley crossed his arms. Look at that. Grandpa must have taught ballet on the side. Laughter, again, loud and clean. Dakota didn't blink. Hadley stepped forward, made a show of gesturing. Or maybe he floats. Do boxers float now? Another burst of laughter. Dakota exhaled and stepped, swung, a single motion, measured, low, simple. No flash, no force, just something remembered. But his foot slipped slightly on the glossy wood, just enough to knock him off balance. He caught himself. Didn't fall. Hadley clapped anyway. And the champ stumbles again. Folks, gravity is still undefeated. This time, the laughter stung sharper. It felt like teeth. Dakota said nothing. He removed the gloves, placed them carefully on the ground, and walked back to the bleachers. He didn't look at anyone. No one stopped him. In the locker room afterward, someone chalked a new outline on the floor, more elaborate than before. A printed sign beside it read, Dakota versus. Physics, 0, 2. No one erased it. The hallway was alive with retellings, like a comedy sketch on repeat, exaggerated and polished with each telling. The punchline had become ritual. No one noticed the janitor standing just down the corridor. Broom paused, eyes on the gym doors. He didn't speak. He just watched. The final bell rang. The hallway emptied. The day was over. The story, however, wasn't. Hadley sat alone in his office later that afternoon, the lights dimmed, the blinds half drawn. His whistle lay on the desk beside a coffee cup gone cold. The clipboard rested in his lap, student names still listed in neat rows. He wasn't reading them. His eyes were locked on a single point on the wall where a photo hung crooked. Last year's dodgeball champions, arms raised in triumph. He didn't move to straighten it. 3 soft knocks came at the door. He didn't answer. The door opened anyway, and there he was. Not a myth, not a meme, not a punchline, just a man. Broad-shouldered, quiet, dressed in a dark button-down with sleeves rolled to the forearms, his knuckles worn and scarred, like time had left stories there. Stallone Norris stepped into the office without asking. He didn't sit. He didn't speak at first. His eyes moved over the room like someone looking at an old arena, remembering where he once bled. Hadley stood awkwardly. One hand hovered near the back of his chair. "Look, he began. "I didn't mean anything by it. The kids were laughing. I thought he was joking." Stallone didn't blink. "You didn't think he was lying. You thought it might be true, and that scared you more." Hadley shifted, swallowing. It was just a joke. Stallone's voice didn't rise. "You laughed first." The words hung in the air like a slow echo. That's all the permission they needed. Hadley looked down. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just stood there, a man used to leading with volume, now stunned into silence by someone who didn't need it. "You made a room out of that silence," Stallone said, his voice steady, "and then you filled it with your voice." They stood like two men on opposite ends of something invisible. Hadley finally whispered, "I didn't know who he was. I didn't know you were real." "You don't need to know who someone was to treat them like who they are," Stallone replied. "You mocked a legacy you didn't earn, and you laughed at a boy who didn't owe you proof." He turned, walked to the door, then paused. "You like being the loudest man in the room. Usually means you're the one who listens least." Then he left. The door didn't slam. It didn't need to. Some exits echo without sound, and when the latch clicked shut, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something had been removed, something that might not return. The next morning, the gym was quiet. Not empty, just still, as if the air had remembered how to be reverent. By the trophy case, tucked between an old photo of the 1998 track team and a dusty championship banner, something new had appeared. No announcement, no ribbon cutting, just a small wooden box mounted to the wall, glass-faced, lit by a single overhead bulb. Inside, a pair of black boxing gloves, worn, faded. The left glove wrapped with a strip of athletic tape, the right glove smooth over the knuckles. Between them, almost hidden unless you looked closely, were stitched initials. SN, below the gloves, a brass plate. You don't wear them to fight, you wear them to remember. Noah walked past them without stopping, not because he didn't see them, because he had already known. Some truths don't need to be spoken to be heard. The weekend passed with a quiet that felt intentional, like even time had decided to lower its voice. At school, Monday arrived without fanfare. The hallways filled with the usual motion, lockers slamming, voices rising and falling. But something in the rhythm had changed, not in big ways. No apologies were made, no announcements broadcasted. But there was a softness now where mockery used to live, a hesitation before a smirk, a pause before a joke. Dakota moved through the corridors the same way he always had, shoulders relaxed, gaze straight, steps even. But now, where silence had once followed him like a shadow, there was something else trailing in its place. Space. Space that people gave him without knowing why. Not avoidance, not admiration. Something quieter. As though they understood, in some wordless way, that they had misread the page of a story they never took the time to understand. No one spoke to him about Friday. Not in class, not at lunch, not in the locker room. The chalk outline on the gym floor was gone. Scrubbed clean, not replaced. In the main hallway outside the gym, near the row of trophy cases and faded class photos, the new display remained, quiet and untouched. A modest wooden frame mounted to the wall, its glass panel smudged slightly at the edges from curious fingertips. Inside sat the gloves, black leather, visibly aged, with small cracks forming like rivers at the joints. The left glove had that thin strip of white tape, the kind fighters wrap in haste before a final round. The right was worn smooth across the knuckles, as if it had struck more than it ever caught. Between the gloves, the initials stitched in black thread on black leather, barely noticeable unless you stepped close. SN. Beneath it, on a brass plaque barely larger than a business card, the inscription was simple. You don't wear them to fight, you wear them to remember. Dakota passed the display every morning on his way to first period. He never stopped, he never slowed, but his eyes always flicked toward it, like checking that it hadn't vanished overnight, like making sure the memory it held was still breathing behind the glass. Students walked by without fanfare. Some glanced at it, some didn't, but no one touched it, not even once, as if an invisible boundary had formed around it, respected even by the loudest among them. At lunch, Dakota sat at his usual table, alone. Not because no one would sit with him, but because he hadn't moved. Some routines were worth keeping. The noise of the cafeteria filled the space as it always did. Trays clattering, shoes squeaking, voices colliding mid-air. But no one slid a milk carton toward him. No one muttered jokes under their breath. And the meme that had once lived in Jaden's pencil box had disappeared without explanation. No one asked where it went. Mia approached during fifth period, notebook in hand, steps hesitant but firm. She didn't speak at first, just sat down beside him in the quiet of the library where students spread out for project work. Her presence didn't demand anything. She didn't look at him directly, just sat with her knees crossed, her arms around them, her gaze somewhere between the pages of her book and the dusty light falling across the floor. "You okay?" she asked finally. Dakota nodded. She waited a moment, then glanced sideways. "He left a note," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Coach?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the edges softened from being read and reread. He didn't hand it to her. He just held it. "Said I didn't need to prove anything." She leaned back, staring up at the ceiling like it had answers. "You didn't." Dakota didn't say anything, but he didn't look away. That night, the house held the same stillness it always did. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the hallway clock, the creak of the porch beneath the weight of time. Stallone sat outside in his chair, a mug of black coffee cooling beside him, his gaze drifting over the line where sky bled into shadow. Dakota joined him without a word, holding a glass of water. He sat in the chair beside his father's, not too close, not too far. The porch light behind them cast long, soft shadows toward the road. "They put your gloves on the wall," Dakota said. Stallone didn't look over. He nodded once. "Which pair?" "The old ones." "Figures," he murmured. "Only ones that knew what losing felt like." A pause settled between them, long and unhurried. Dakota turned to him, the question rising slow but certain. "What does legacy mean?" Stallone leaned back in his chair, exhaled through his nose, and watched the horizon deepen into night. "It means showing up when it'd be easier to walk away." They sat there a long time. In Dakota's room, the belt still rested on the desk, unworn, untouched. Beside it lay a sketchbook, now open to a fresh page. A pencil sketch filled the center, rough, imperfect, but clear. It wasn't of a boxer, not a ring, not a trophy. It was a hallway. On one wall, the shadow box with the gloves inside. On the other, a boy walking past, head upright, not defiant, not proud, just real. Tuesday morning dawned with gold threading through the clouds, the kind of light that looked soft but carried heat underneath. Dakota walked into school the same way he had every other day that semester. Same hoodie, same step. But something beneath the surface had shifted, barely but enough. He passed the display again. This time he didn't look. He didn't need to. A second-grade girl stood in front of it, her backpack hanging crooked from one shoulder, her tiny finger pointing toward the glass. "That's his grandpa," she whispered to a friend beside her. "He's real." Dakota kept walking, down the hall, around the corner, into the day. Behind him, the gloves stayed where they had been mounted. Silent, still, not asking to be seen, just waiting to be remembered, not to prove something, but to remind someone of what had already been proven. And this time, no one laughed. The morning light fell across the sidewalk in long, slanting lines, warming the pavement but failing to soften the cool bite of early spring. Dakota moved along the edge of the school building like he always did, his shoulders level, his backpack resting in that familiar place between balance and wear. Nothing about his posture had changed, not outwardly. But the way he carried silence was different now. It no longer hung on him like a shield or a burden. It walked beside him. Inside, the hallway buzzed with the sounds of a school trying to return to its usual rhythm. There were still assignments to be turned in, quizzes to prepare for, forgotten locker combinations to mutter through clenched teeth. Students filled the halls in pairs and clusters, the hum of teenage conversation rising and falling in patterns that had nothing to do with legacy or boxing or names once laughed at. The echo of those things still lived in the air, but faintly now, like something long packed away. The gloves remained on the wall, untouched. Tucked between the trophy case and the photo of the '98 track team, the display had become part of the school's architecture, neither glorified nor dismissed. Students passed by it without ceremony. Some looked, some didn't, but no one joked anymore. No one drew a mustache on the glass. No one added fake scores to the plaque. The brass plate beneath the gloves still read the same words, and every time Dakota passed it, he felt something steady anchor inside him. Not pride, not victory, just truth. At lunch, the table by the window was still his. It wasn't marked, wasn't claimed, but everyone knew not to sit there. Not because they feared him and not because they idolized him. It was a quiet respect, an understanding that some spaces belonged to people who had earned them without ever asking. He sat with his tray, sandwich, apple, bottle of water, untouched for a few minutes as he watched the cafeteria stir with its usual chaos. Then, without looking up, he began to eat. Slowly, methodically, like someone choosing to exist rather than endure. The jokes had stopped, but not because someone told them to. They had simply run out of power. Jaden, the boy who had once drawn the first meme, now walked past him without speaking. His eyes flickered toward Dakota's table, then away again. No sneer, no apology, just silence. It was enough. Later that day, Dakota stopped by the main office to drop off a permission slip. As he stepped out into the hallway, he noticed Coach Hadley standing alone outside the gym doors, his usual clipboard absent. The coach glanced up as Dakota passed. Their eyes met. Hadley didn't speak. Dakota didn't stop, but something passed between them, subtle and unspoken, a recognition of lines crossed, of things learned too late. When Dakota reached the far end of the hall, he heard the coach's voice behind him. Not loud, not performative. "We put it up Friday after school." Dakota turned slightly, not fully, just enough to show he had heard. Hadley nodded once toward the gloves. Felt like the kind of story that didn't need more words. Dakota stood there, looking not at the coach, but at the display. The leather, the stitching, the stillness. After a moment, he asked, "Whose idea was it?" There was a pause. Then Hadley said, "Does it matter?" Dakota didn't respond. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He just turned back toward the hallway and walked on. That night, the house breathed like a living thing. The dryer was silent. The kitchen sink didn't drip. The porch boards creaked once beneath old weight, then settled. Inside, Dakota sat at his desk, the old championship belt resting beside his sketchbook. The page he worked on was almost finished. It showed the hallway, not crowded, not quiet, just real. On one side, the glass case with the gloves inside. On the other, a boy, back straight, head forward, walking past with steady steps. His hands were empty. His shadow stretched behind him, long and unbroken. The drawing didn't try to impress. It didn't scream to be seen. It just was. Downstairs, the porch light flickered once, then held steady. Stallone sat in his chair, the wooden slats groaning beneath him like an old ship. He wasn't drinking coffee, just sitting, breathing the night air. His hands rested on his thighs, fingers interlocked, his eyes somewhere between memory and horizon. Dakota joined him without a word, carried nothing, not a sketchbook, not a belt, just himself. They sat together for a long time. The wind moved through the trees in gentle shivers. Far off, a car door slammed. Somewhere, a dog barked once. They stopped, Dakota said. Stallone didn't ask who. He didn't need to. Dakota leaned back slightly, his hands folded in his lap. I think they get it now. His father's voice was slow and even. They don't need to get it. You do. Dakota nodded, more to himself than to his father. A pause. Then he said, The gloves, they're not really about winning, are they? Stallone's gaze didn't move. No. What are they about? Staying. Dakota let that sit. And remembering, Stallone added, quieter, not just who you are, but who you came from, what was carried before you ever stepped in the ring. They watched the sky bleed from blue into ash, the stars slow to reveal themselves. Eventually, Dakota asked, You think it matters to them now? Stallone didn't answer right away. Then, with the faintest tilt of his head, he said, It matters to you. That's enough. The next morning, Dakota dressed without hurry. He packed his bag, ate a quiet breakfast. When he left the house, his father stayed seated at the table, coffee in hand, watching him go with a look that didn't follow, only accompanied. At school, nothing extraordinary waited for him. No crowd, no camera, just the day. He passed the glass case again. Didn't stop. Near the lockers, he noticed a folded sheet of paper pinned to the board where students posted club announcements. In simple handwriting it read, Some names don't need to be spoken to be known. No one had signed it. He didn't need to know who did. At recess, Dakota sat under the old tree by the fence. It had become his spot, long before anyone noticed. The ground beneath it was worn from his sneakers, the bark smoothed from where he sometimes leaned. He sat cross-legged, sketchbook resting on his knees, pencil tracing soft lines. Mia approached again, this time with a book under her arm, her steps more sure than last time. She sat beside him without asking, said nothing at first. Then, after a while, she glanced at the sketch. That's the hallway, isn't it? He nodded. She tilted her head. And that's you. He didn't correct her. She looked at the page a moment longer, then leaned back against the tree. It's good. Thanks. They sat in silence for a long time. Not the awkward kind, the real kind. The kind that comes after a truth has been spoken and nothing more needs to be said. When the final bell rang that day, Dakota walked the same route toward the exit, past the display, past the photos, past the fading outlines of stories that no longer had the same hold. He stepped out into the sun, shoulders light, heart steady. Behind him, the gloves remained, stitched with memory, wrapped in quiet, not needing to fight, just needing to be there. Some truths don't echo, they land and stay. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out the other videos on the channel for more. And if this one spoke to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.